Welcome everyone, Costini here with a discussion about the Grudge system in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. With the rework, obviously things have changed about the Grudges, and I've already covered that in multiple videos. But what I want to talk about here is the consequences of the Grudge system change, because since my first video on the subject of the Dwarf rework, obviously I have played quite a bit more. Not in this campaign specifically, though this campaign was a very, very lucky one for me. Not in the sense that, oh, I won over here in Nagron, that's pretty normal, but rather that, well, Forgrim and Ungrim and even Bellegarde did quite well in this campaign, so I was really able to take advantage of that to make a massive, massive Dwarf empire. But still, I have played quite a bit of the Dwarves ever since I got access to Thrones of Decay, to patch 5.0. And what I've noticed is that if you're playing Nurgle, if you're playing in the Empire, in a sense the game, sure, for all the new additions, for all the campaign changes, you're still playing a campaign, you're still playing a game where the best part, the more interesting part, if you will, the part where all the stakes are, is in the early game. That's just how the game works right now. That's because, you know, you play the early game, you establish an empire, you gain control of a lot of territory, and after that, there's not really that many threats. And this is what is really different about the Dwarves and with the new Grudge system, and it's specifically because of the Grudge system. So first off, because of Age of Reckoning, you have an incentive to go deal with your foes. But I do want to make a point particularly clear on this subject. It's not just a case of like, oh, you're going to constantly conquer territory and that will be enough. Not quite. See, if you actually expand as quickly as I have in this campaign, you might actually end up in a Grudge deficit because you're far, far outpacing the number of Grudges that you will gain from a campaign. So over here, like, this army is 700, but many settlements may not necessarily be that much, and I'm at the point where I need 44,000 Grudges for a single Age of Reckoning. I can do it, but you can see that there's plenty of foes that aren't necessarily going to give that many Grudges at this particular point, because, well, we largely wiped them out. But instead, what happens, and again, this is like an exceptional campaign in the sense that Forgrim and Ungrim did quite well, Bellegarde did quite well, which I imagine in the vast majority of campaigns that will not happen. So when faced with the vast majority of Dwarven campaigns, you're going to end up with foes that are going to accumulate a lot of Grudges. Like, I've seen armies with like 2k Grudges or very, very close to 2k Grudges. Like, for instance, in one campaign, Vlad had like 1.8k, an army with 1.8k. So the more an enemy succeeds against Dwarf factions in general, the more they take like key Dwarf settlements, the more Grudges they add to their armies. The more those armies stay on the field, the more Grudges they add. So this system rewards you, if you will, or incentivizes you to deal with powerful opponents. Because the more you play the campaign, the more power you gain, the more Grudges you're going to need to sell. Now, the scale of these Grudges is something perhaps CH should change, because like right now you're being punished, so to speak, if you do confederate the minor Dwarf factions, not just the major ones, through the Legendary Lord Grudges. So the amount of Grudges you are required to gain, that does increase because of that. Still, what this means is, like, if there's significant threats to the Dwarves in a campaign, they are going to gain Grudges. But it's not necessarily equal. Like, there's, like, Chaos Main gain more Grudges, Elves gain a lot of Grudges. So that's going to incentivize a different kind of campaign playstyle. Like, for instance, over here in this campaign, I conquered Ulthuan. Something I would never really bother with in any Dwarven campaign because the climate is uninhabitable. But I did it here. I mean, I did make an alliance with Nakari to sell Ulthuan to him, but I did conquer Ulthuan. It worked pretty decently. And the reason I did Ulthuan is because of two things. One, there were a lot of Grudges on the Elves, so wipe out the Elves, ally Chaos to wipe out the Elves. That's how Dwarves feel about the Elves in this particular patch. Maybe, you know, Chaos should give the most Grudges. That's a different discussion, right? But still, wipe out the elves, fight an opponent that you would almost never bother with, for the most part, and get rewarded for it. Be incentivized to do things that you would not necessarily do by default. And that's just because one of the main reasons for that is like there are a lot of grudges over here in Wolf 1 from Tarion, Elfarian, and Alariel. Okay, so that's just with the meter over here. But then there is another twist to all of this, to this particular subject. And that is, of course, the legendary grudges. Which, beyond the fact that this system already incentivizes you to deal with foes, powerful foes that gain a lot of power, which is not necessarily something that you do have in a regular campaign. Like, sure, you might have powerful foes that are close to you in key territories that you would want to deal with, but there's foes in territories that you will not bother with that can be really powerful, so, why deal with that? Why not just go after the smaller foes, win your campaign in other ways, right? But there's a second element to all of this, and that second element is those legendary grudges. So now you are incentivized further to do things that you would not have done in a normal campaign. So, secure all the northern, all the World's Edge mountains. Okay, you would probably typically do that. Go annihilate the elves. You likely wouldn't do that. Go deal with all the grudges in the south, including dealing with Krokar and Khorne. You might deal with some of these factions, like Manfred, of course, who doesn't like beating out Manfred and Khorne, but like dealing with Krokar, dealing with Teclis, maybe something you wouldn't do. Go and conquer both Hellpit and Skaven Blight. Might do it, might not do it, depends on the campaign. Also depends on how Kislev does against Clan Mulder. Clan Scryer probably would typically do that, but still. Go beat up... Go beat up the Chaos Dwarfs, who are really, really powerful. Like, it's either going to be a case of, like, Gremgor is really powerful, or the Chaos Dwarfs are going to be really powerful. And in this case, yeah, the Chaos Dwarfs came out on top, so now I have the prospect of a very significant war. And it's like, yeah, there's a lot of people that need grudging in this particular campaign. For instance, go beat up all of Athaloran and purge it to the ground. Like, you almost never would bother with that because it's like, I mean, sure, the Oak of Ages does provide a landmark, so that just means beating up Orion. But conquering all of Athaloran, dealing with Durfu, yeah, that's that pretty nasty thing. Go deal with all of Norska. Go deal with all of the Dark Elves. Like, the way these grudges are designed is obviously like, you have legendary grudges available in every campaign, but they're clearly designed for some campaigns more than others. Like, this one is designed for Thorgrim and Ungrim and Forik to a certain extent. This one is more so designed for Belegar. This one is certainly for Forik. This one, kind of for Ungrim and Belegar, I would say, to an extent. But keep in mind the distant confederation you do have. That's also shifting things around. This one's for all of them. Belegar. Malachi, given his starting position, so conquer all of Norska, deal with Nagorond and Harganef and Marathi, and then, yeah, deal with Queek and Skarsnik, take the Silver Pinnacle, and this might seem an easy grudge, but I've learned that the hard way. You're going to get endgame vampire armies the moment you start trying to seal the tombs. So there's going to be a lot of people. Like, they spawn continuously. And it's like, it might be even more difficult than an endgame crisis, because an endgame crisis just spawns a couple of armies initially. Now, this will keep spawning until you seal the tombs, and you can fail it, and it'll just keep spawning. Sure, you can farm them for experience, I imagine. But what all of this amounts to, really, is that the grudge system may just help make a Dwarven campaign far more interesting than pretty much any campaign in general, because it's creating incentives for the player to not just bother with the early game. Because, yeah, you bother with the early game, you conquer the campaign, and then you're just pretty much done. And everything else is just fluff, like, just something you're dealing with for the sake of, a statistic here, right? For a long campaign victory, if even that, right? So that's one of the problems with the late game. The incentive, like, you no longer have an incentive for survival. You know you've won, and there's very few things that are going to defeat you. But now, you do have an incentive to keep playing longer because of the Age of Reckoning and because of those objectives and the legendary grudges. So that, from my perspective, does have the potential of making the mid-game, the late game, a lot more fun and a lot more interesting. Add to that the distant confederation that you have in every dwarf campaign, and that's also something that's going to shift the dynamic around in a campaign by quite a bit. So it has improved. So I'm not sure if CA thought about this necessarily, but the consequences of what they've done is such that you are going to end up in that kind of situation where you're more incentivized to play longer dwarf campaigns, and playing a longer campaign, just reuniting the realm, deal with this myriads of foes, constantly dealing with Age of Reckonings, can be quite a bit of fun. And it feels rewarding. Like, ultimately, if you're dealing with a challenge, you want it to feel rewarding. And just taking more territory is not particularly a great incentive. Taking more territory and getting, miners, for instance, an army ability would call the miners, or various landmarks, or being able to get around things faster with Underway. If you deal with Norska, that is certainly an incentive that just doesn't exist in the base game at the moment. So that's maybe one of the more significant things that Creative Assembly has done with 5.0, with all the reworks. Because, they fixed a lot of things about Nurgle, they fixed a lot of things about the Empire, but it's like, when you're playing an Imperial campaign, it still feels like, 30, 40, 60 turns. On average, I think the player base plays like 80, but a lot of people obviously play on lower difficulties and they take it slower than me. For me, it's like between turns 30 and 60, depends on the campaigns. That's where the meat of it, like between turns 1 to 30 is the most interesting part of the campaign, but you can drag it on reasonably so to like turn 60. But now, this campaign, I won't play it further because I was just testing various things, but there's plenty of incentives and plenty of reasons for me to keep playing this particular campaign. And again, as I said earlier, this was a very, very lucky campaign. Because I didn't end up with Thorgrim effectively wiped out and having to rescue his ass. I didn't end up with Ungrim effectively wiped out and having to rescue his ass. I didn't have to, which can happen and does happen. Like, I've played other Dwarven campaigns where it's like either one or both of them not necessarily get wiped out completely, but they end up losing a lot of territory. So when you confederate them, like say Grombrindle, you may have Skarsnik to deal with, you may have Warzak to deal with, you may have Azak to deal with, you may have a lot of things to deal with and a lot of bastards to kill, which that does mean that you've got more stuff. So between the Distant Confederation, the Age of Reckoning, the Legendary Grudges, it is a hell of a trip. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.